Greetings. I am Dr. Graciela Caneiro Livingston, Provost at Nebraska Wesleyan University. I want to welcome you to this year's presentation of Spooky Evenings. We here at Nebraska Wesleyan are excited and proud of this event that brings together scholars, artists, authors, and filmmakers to discuss the topic of horror in its various manifestations across the arts and the humanities. Professor Juan Jose Castaño Marquez and Dr. Matthew Jarvis have been working tirelessly to bring you the best scholarship in the field of horror through this unparalleled digital humanities event. I would like to acknowledge the generous support from the Nebraska Arts Council, Humanities Nebraska, and the Nebraska Cultural Endowment that helps make quality programming like Spooky Evenings possible. Again, welcome and enjoy this presentation of Spooky Evenings.
Tonight on Spooky Evenings, Dr. Adrian Schober of the University of Melbourne gives a talk entitled From the Eternal Sea He Rises, Paranoia, Politics, and the Omen. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my guest, Adrian Schober. Welcome, sir.
Hello, how are you?
I'm very well. It's morning for you, it's evening for us. It's always evening for us.
Yes.
This is our first transcontinental live spooky evening.
Well, as I said earlier, Matthew, I hope nobody has any trouble with my accent, because it must sound a little bit strange among all the other accents in the series so far.
I mean, we get a wide range of guests.
Yeah. Well, I'm very honored to be invited and to be included among such distinguished company. So thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm very excited. And of course, I'm excited that you also are part of the Devil's Advocate series with your book on the Omen coming out. So I'll go ahead and give a shout out to that.
Oh, great. So I can actually plug my book because I have a whole slide dedicated to that. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Which is topical because your talk tonight is on the Omen. From the Eternal Sea He Rises, Paranoia, Politics, and the Omen.
That's right. Okay, well, I'll start sharing now. And
yes, please.
I'm just dealing with a particular aspect of my book, as you can imagine, because there's a lot of stuff in there. And like today's talk, it kind of sees me returning to my research roots, so to speak. And because I've had a long-standing interest in the topic of evil children, and this formed the focus of my PhD. And this was published as a book in 2004. It was called Possessed Child Narratives in Literature and Film, Contrary States, which is a bit of a mouthful, I admit. I would rethink the title today, but as the title suggests, I concentrate on a special case of the evil child. And when I was writing my PhD, I remember the literature in this area being quite scant, that there were just a few articles, some chapters, but nothing really sustained. And my book was an attempt to fill in this gap. Of course, if you fast forward to 2021, there's an absolute proliferation of books and papers and articles on cruel and malevolent, possessed, satanic, psychopathic, uncanny, or other children. It's become, as we like to say in academia, a very sexy research topic. But when my book went out into the world, I didn't have what you'd call a reputation. I still don't know what that means. And it kind of went out with much fanfare. There were no endorsements. There were no reviews, and it kind of fell under the radar. I can say that I think I've received some belated recognition and some citations and so forth. But since then, I think my book has been eclipsed by better books. I think there's more sophisticated analyses and theorizing of this image. So I just maybe think maybe I deserve some credit for helping to get the conversation going. But in the book, I examine the lost possessed child as first and foremost as an American phenomenon that can be traced to certain religious and cultural factors in the United States. So I look at a range of narratives. I examine Henry James's The Turn of the Screw. I look at The Exorcist. I examine Robert Wise's very underrated Audrey Rose. I think there's a whole devil's advocate on that, and some other examples. So some may think that I'm splitting hairs, but in the book, I actually make a distinction between a child that is represented as possessed, the repository of evil, so a child that's inhabited by a satanic or an alien intelligence, and the child as satanic, the incarnation of evil. And in this category, I would place the Omen. But I don't deal with the Omen at great length in my book because it was kind of outside the remit of my analysis. And quite honestly, I was just looking for ways to contain my subject, which I think, if anything, reflects my own limitations as a scholar at the time. So I feel that since then, I've been following up a lot of leads in my research and tying up some loose ends. And I think the Omen represents a case in point. And I kind of knew that I would return to it someday. So as examples of big budget Hollywood horror, the Omen, I think, is often mentioned in the same context or even in the same breath as The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby. I mean, we know that they were made by different hands and by different studios, but they almost form an unofficial trilogy in people's minds. And these films, they marked a shift from very traditional depictions of Hollywood, of God in the Bible, to much more alternative and darker supernatural themes. The film was directed by Richard Donner and written by David Seltzer. And initial reviews compared it quite insistently with The Exorcist. But I actually think Rosemary's Baby is more of an apt comparison, given the devil's spawn, do no more, and all the references to Satanism and cults and conspiracy. The reviews for The Omen upon its release were quite polarized. Some thought it was quite good and well put together, but other critics just roasted the film. And I think over the years, the reputation of the film kind of continued to suffer. It's actually included in the Medved brothers book, the 50 worst films of all time, believe it or not. And Gregory Peck's performance is an easy target for criticism. But today, I think the film is acknowledged as a classic, if only a minor one. If it's not quite as good as Rosemary's Baby or The Exorcist, I still think it's a very stylish and it's a very well-crafted horror film, which repays closer attention and analysis. So, yeah, it was directed by Richard Donner. This was his breakout movie. Prior to that, he had directed just three very undistinguished features. And Donner has said that, after directing The Omen, he really felt that he didn't have anything else to prove. It was written by David Seltzer, an upcoming writer, and produced by Harvey Bernard. And it starred quite a distinguished cast, Gregory Peck and Lee Remick, which lent much welcome prestige to the project. And the rest of the cast were filled out by some very good character actors. Quite predictably, it was released on June 6, 1976, and that's where it received its UK premiere. And it was the subject of a very elaborate publicity campaign. It eventually grossed about $60.9 million, which doesn't sound much then, but if adjusted for inflation, it would be around $280 million today. So I attended this film as a devil's advocate entry, and I think, Matthew, you've given me an opportunity to plug my book, so I'm going to take you up on that offer. But I don't think the series needs much of an introduction from horror buffs, but the series is the brainchild of John Atkinson, who's always open to new ideas and to new submissions. It's kind of like the BFI Film Classic series, except I think it's a bit more lowbrow, and it's devoted to classics of horror cinema. So it's a very worthwhile series with an ever-growing number of titles, and I think there's about 60 to date. So yeah, I want to thank you for being able to talk a little bit about my book. Like the other entries in the series, it covers the genesis and the authorship, the production history and marketing and reception of the Omen. So I'm not going to deal with these aspects here. Rather, I want to draw out a particular strand of my argument, which centers on paranoia in the film. For I see paranoia as the driver of the narrative. So this includes paranoia about the end times, about government and conspiracy, about child rearing, and paranoia about threats to the establishment from liberal and post-cultural forces of the 1970s. So all these different forms of paranoia, they're obviously intertwined, but I want to focus particularly on the Omen's impenetrable politics. But before I continue, I feel I need to issue some sort of disclaimer, because I don't profess to be an expert on American politics, and I have no qualification or degree in political science. But as an Australian scholar, let's say I come as an interested observer of American politics. And what I want to simply do today is illuminate what I think the film is doing ideologically and politically and otherwise. So I want to open with a piece of religious doggerel that I think you'll be familiar with if you've seen the movie. When the Jews return to Zion and a comet rips the sky and the Holy Roman Empire rises, then you and I must die. From the eternal sea he rises, creating armies on either shore, turning man against his brother, till man exists no more. These are words spoken by Father Brennan, who's played by the wonderful Patrick Troughton. It's a wonderfully hysterical, over-top performance, but he delivers these words to Ambassador Robert Thorne, warning him of the signs of the Antichrist. So when moviegoers saw The Omen for the first time in the summer of 1976, many, I think, were so taken by the chilling biblical prophecy that they took this rhyme as quoted directly from the good book itself. And I think it's a very beguiling piece of doggerel. I think pastiche is the right word. And writer David Seltzer has intimated that, I made up the rhyme, but I did not make up the prediction of these events. I went in every possible way I could with the biblical symbolism from the book of Revelations. I always like to give credit to writers, and I should point out that Seltzer also wrote the novelization, which still stands as one of the best-selling novelizations of all time. And there's a common misconception that The Omen was based on a book. And the book was actually written during production, and it was released a few weeks before the film. But many people think that the film came first and that the book came first and the film came afterwards. Seltzer was just, I think, fulfilling a need. I think the producers realized that they didn't have a book to pre-sell the film, so he actually wrote one to order. So as well as reading different versions of Revelation, David Seltzer has said that he consulted various interpretive texts by theologians and scholars, and Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth seems a likely source, and this was published in 1970. And the book, it includes such speculations about America's so-called decline, European unification. There's a little bit of Vatican conspiracy theory in there. It talks about the creation of a modern Jewish state, which all these things he interpreted as signs of the end times. And Lindsey laid great stress on the Great Tribulation, a period of about 7 years where there would be famine and pestilence and disasters and war. And many think that we're living through this right now. So this, of according to Lindsay, and would mark the reign of Satan in a figure called the Antichrist. Only the days of the Antichrist's reign would be numbered and cut short by Christ's second coming and the establishment of his millennial kingdom. So prior to the release of the Omen, the when and where of the apocalypse was much debated. The Jehovah's Witnesses had actually pinpointed 1975 as the probable year for the end times, or Armageddon. And the failure of this prediction led to a sharp decline in the denomination's membership. But these kind of very apocalyptic fears, I think they found particular urgency in the Pentecostalist and fundamentalist movements and in the so-called evangelical resurgence of the 1970s. So I have a page open here from Newsweek. Newsweek proclaimed 1976 the year of the evangelical. So it's all very interesting because this is to say that the Omen, for all its Catholic trappings, is probably more Protestant and maybe even evangelical in its outlook and its eschatology. And W. S. Scott Poole, he points out in his excellent book, Satan in America, and I noticed, Matthew, that he's also here on your roster of speakers, and he's written an excellent book that's a highly readable account of the influence of the devil on American religion and politics and culture. But he points out that a new evangelical fascination with the devil's influence supplied David Seltzer with the basic story arc for the Omen, and which led to an ex post facto trilogy. So it was followed by Damien, Omen 2 in 1978, which is actually quite a good sequel. I think it's probably one of the better sequels of the 1970s. It fills that very difficult middle act and the final conflict, which I think must be one of the great fizzes in series history. I think we can suitably ignore Omen for The Awakening, which was made much later, and it was made for Canadian television. But today I really want to maybe focus more on the Omen on its own terms before it became this franchise. So in having the story of the Antichrist's ascension in England end with its implied residency in the White House, and I'll talk about the ending later, I think the Omen goes right to the fear of corruption and conspiracy in American government. And this linking of Satan with American politics, it goes back to colonial and revolutionary times. You can see the image on the left that Thomas Jefferson was actually aligned with the Antichrist, as would later presidents such as John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon, and much later Barack Obama and Donald Trump. The Omen makes explicit the link between Satan and politics. And I think after revelations about the Pentagon Papers and Watergate and other agency cover-ups, it was maybe perhaps not too much of a leap to think that there might be satanic forces in the White House, that indeed Richard Milhouse Nixon, the 37th president of the United States and a Republican, might be Satan himself. In the US, trust in government institutions, it kind of plunged from an all-time high of 80% in 1966 to around 25% in 1981. And this very toxic lack of trust, it manifested itself as paranoia. And of course, this was already fermented in the 1960s with, conspiracy theories about the slaying of John F. Kennedy, mounting doubts over the findings of the Warren Report and the slaying of Kennedy's brother later in the decade. And this insecurity and fear, it would reach, I think, new intensity in the 1970s. British journalist Francis Wheen has labelled these years the golden age of paranoia. He writes that it was a pungent melange of apocalyptic dread and conspiratorial fever. It's very interesting if you read accounts of American history in the 1970s, it almost reads like a history of the present. You can actually see a lot of parallels between the 1970s and now. But in the 1970s, this paranoia, it not only expressed itself in the increasingly paranoid style of Richard Nixon's government, but also in the apocalyptic predictions of mainstream and fringe religions, doomsday cults such as Reverend Jim Jones's People's Temple, and also I think an acute sense of doom regarding environmental damage and the impact of overpopulation. This is an anxiety that's actually dealt with in Damien, Omen 2. So in the 1970s, a new generation of American left-wing filmmakers captured the national mood. And I think, as Robert Kolker documents in his very admirable book, A Cinema of Loneliness, that these films, he says, were a conduit for the shudder that went through the culture and its dominant ideologies during the 60s and 70s, in which images and narratives of despair and impotence alternated or were combined with violent outbursts against the self and others. And these films, they spoke of paranoia and loss. So I'm thinking of films like The Conversation, Alan J. Pakula's so-called Paranoid trilogy. All the President's Men was actually released in the same year as The Omen, 1976. I think it's almost like the unspoken other of The Omen. 3 Days of the Condor, a personal favourite. And if we were going to jump genres now, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which has a very thinly veiled subtext about conspiracy, and also The Omen. So I think you could, I think The Omen ought to be included among these so-called paranoid texts of the 1970s. And Paul Cobley, in an article, he writes that what these narratives have in common is a concern with the deceptiveness of appearances, the way that the familiar becomes threatening. Yet he writes, what is crucial about the paranoid text of the 70s is that it is the site of a complex and contradictory political struggle. Nixonian and anti-Nixonian paranoia enjoyed a symbiotic relationship. I think The Omen 2 is also the site of a political struggle, and it's both Nixonian and anti-Nixonian in its implications. It depends on how you read it and what you bring to the film. The Omen, it begins in Rome, the seat of Roman Catholic power, the home of the Vatican, and chief residence of popes since medieval times. So when we meet statesman Robert Thorne, he's in the back seat of a limousine. He's appearing very solemn as he's chauffeured through the city streets in the early hours, and a title tells us exactly that it's Rome, June 6, 6 a.m. And then we hear an asynchronous voiceover. It belongs to Father Spoleto, who tells us that the child is dead. He breathed for a moment, then he breathed no more. The child is dead. Then I think it's very interesting because Donna, he shoots the tete-a-tete between the statesman and the priest through a row of balusters overlooking the anteroom of the Catholic hospital as Robert comes to terms with the news that his son has just died on delivery. So it's as if we're flies on the wall and we're overhearing a secret conversation and in due course a plot. And I think if you look at the manner of the framing here, it also suggests how this is unfolding under Satan's watchful eye. So when Father Spoleto suggests they adopt a child, Robert intimates that Kathy wanted her own, but he reconsiders and he kind of thereby enters into conspiracy, one in which his stillborn will be substituted for a newborn, born in the exact same moment his son has died. And the foundling, the father assures the diplomat has no relatives and the mother has died in childbirth. And then they make an implicit vow of secrecy, and not even his wife will be aware of the deception. And on this night, Mr. Thorne, the priest, announces, God has given you a son. But of course, we know that his words will carry a terrible irony. For unbeknown to us, Father Spoleto, and there's an inset of the fire-disfigured Father Spoleto, along with his accomplice, Father Brennan, the Irish priest who later repents and tries to warn Robert of Damien's true identity. They're in fact renegade priests and apostates of Satan. In their conflating of Satanism with Catholicism, critic Penelope Gilliatt noticed how such films as The Omen and Damien Omen 2, I'm quoting, play on a vulgar streak of anti-popery that lingers in Anglo-Saxon countries. Perhaps the fact that Catholicism now yields the most potent idea of the devil has led filmmakers to make hay with this prejudice. I think it's very interesting how in the 1970s and up to the early 1980s that Catholicism was almost like the go-to religion of Hollywood horror. And, you see it in Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist and of course, The Omen, Amityville Horror and Amityville 2, The Possession. But I think in the case of The Omen, it makes hay with a prejudice of a Roman Catholic conspiracy to gain control and enforce Satan's will over nations. So you can see its anti-Semitic counterpart in a worldwide Jewish conspiracy, but this is a Catholic conspiracy. And as Poole writes in his book, he says that Satan, cloaked in the red robes of the Catholic Church, became a permanent part of Protestant America's conception of demonic evil. Reborn in the 1920s, fear of Satan's work through Catholicism would find new life in a renewed nativism. A supposed connection between the Catholic Church and the work of the Antichrist made end-time speculation an especially virulent discourse. So when presidential nominee Al Smith was defeated in the presidential primaries of 1928, the Protestant majority feared that his Catholic faith would make him a puppet of the Pope in Rome. He was the first Roman Catholic to be nominated for president in the US. It wasn't until 1960 that the nation was prepared to elect its first Catholic president in a Democrat, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, but not, of course, without controversy. And of course, we had to wait nearly 60 years for a second Catholic president in Joe Biden, another Democrat, who I think has probably placed his Catholic faith a little bit more front and center. So while Jack and wife Jacqueline brought a fashionable face to American Catholicism, Kennedy himself, and Poole also documents this in his book, was rumored by some right-wing elements to be Satan's chief disciple. And owing to his Roman Catholicism, it was claimed that he had cast 666 votes during his term as senator. And I think it's very interesting that these very irrational fears, they find expression in the very celebrated dream sequence of Rosemary's Baby, where you have wannabe mother Rosemary Woodhouse, played by Mia Farrow, who imagines an encounter with JFK in Navy uniform on a yacht before she's satanically and ritually abused. And the Pope also appears in her dream carrying a suitcase, and he's granting his forgiveness, and he's proffering his ring for her to kiss. And as Tony Williams argues in Hearths of Darkness, that Roman Catholicism here is depicted as exclusive as Satanism with its particular rites. The dream sequence implicitly suggests the real reasons behind JFK's surprising 1960 electoral victory. So as a multimillionaire diplomat and presidential hopeful, I think it's very significant that Thorne, like Kennedy, is Catholic, at least implicitly, and not Protestant. And the novelization gives us a little bit more background on this point, that the Thornes were both of Catholic parentage, but neither of them were particularly religious. So if Thorne were successful in his bid, it would make him, pre-Biden, of course, the second Catholic president in US history. David Salsa, who prior to writing The Omen had been involved in political television documentaries, including the ABC special, The Unfinished Journey of Robert F. Kennedy. And he's actually intimated that he did have the Kennedys in mind. So he's actually confirmed that. And I think the fact that Robert is also an ambassador is very significant. The United States ambassador to the United Kingdom, also known as the ambassador of the United States to the Court of St. James, is a highly prestigious position in the United States Foreign Service that has also served as a stepping stone for later presidents such as John Adams and Martin Van Buren and James Buchanan. And it was also, I guess, a stepping stone for wannabe presidents like Joseph P. Kennedy. So it's very significant that he's an ambassador. But despite the Kennedy connection, Robert's political affiliation remains vague. And it's interesting that the words Democrat or Republican, or for that matter, Catholic, are never so much as uttered in the film. So like you kind of meant to fill in some gaps here. So belonging to a family dynasty, Robert and Catherine Thorne, they're very rich, they're attractive, and they're very photogenic. And they're painted in only the broadest of strokes. And I think we only find out in Damien Omen too that the family-owned Thorne Industries made their fortune in electronics and energies. So what I think Celsa has done here is he's kind of given viewers a general outline and a thumbline sketch, and he's calling on us to fill in some of the details. So I think The Omen is a film that you kind of really take to it what you bring to it. As the perfect heterosexual nuclear family, Robert is the breadwinner father, Kathy's the stay-at-home mother, albeit with a nursemaid and servants in her employ. Feminism seems to have hardly touched her in her affluent existence, or at least maybe she has no need for it. She's much younger than Peck, and Remick was 20 years Peck's junior when she took on the role. So it's led Robin Wood to note that on the surface, The Omen is, quote, old-fashioned, it's traditional, it's reactionary. The goodness of the family unit isn't questioned. Horror is disowned by having the devil child, a product of the old world, first in Italy and then England, unwittingly adopted into the American family. But as we shall see, this is not so simple, and there's a lot more going on here. So before the final conflict wreaked havoc on the timeline of the series, it was reasonable enough to assume that the events of The Omen were contemporaneous. So the year 1976, and this is paratextually reaffirmed by the publicity campaign. We're told on many of the posters that today's the 6th day of the 6th month of 1976. And as I mentioned earlier, it was also the date for the UK premiere. On November 2nd, 1976, Republican Gerald Ford narrowly lost to Democrat Jimmy Carter. Carter, a former governor of his home state of Georgia, he positioned himself as a political outsider, as different from Nixon as one could get, and promising a fresh start. However, the one-term president would soon be accused of ineffectual government as he combated the energy crisis and rampant inflation and unemployment. And in his now infamous Malaise speech delivered on June 15, 1979, Carter spoke of a crisis of confidence in the land. He said, "We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation." As disenchantment for Carter set in, Democrat turned Republican Ronald Reagan mobilized the Christian right, including conservative Evangelical Protestants and Roman Catholics, and the more secular New Right in his 1980 presidential campaign. The so-called great communicator, he kind of railed against welfare spending, the soft approach to crime, moral decay, and big government. And I think to millions of Americans, Reagan offered this message of hope and opportunity that contrasted very starkly with Carter's pessimism. And as Cruz and Zelizer write in their excellent book, Fault Lines, that whatever the powers of persuasion, that Reagan alone could not remake the political landscape. The new movements of the 1970s had created a powerful base for conservatism, but liberalism remained a force in national politics. For all its fracturing in the 1970s, the New Deal state dominated. Moreover, this right would turn in the 1970s. It wasn't inevitable. It wasn't this automatic thing. In fact, it was fiercely contested. It involved a massive mobilization by activists and organizations and political elites associated with the conservative movement. What I think, though, is very interesting. I've just given you a bit of a potted history of the 1970s, and you might take issue with certain points in my account. But I think for a film about the devil's child rise in the world of politics, I think The Omen is quite remarkable for its lack of engagement with world events and politics. So this is a scene in the film where Robert and Jennings engage in some theological speculation about the end times. Jennings is played by David Warner, and he's the photographer, or paparazzo, if we were going to be less kind, who uncovers some strange anomalies in the photographs that he's taken. And these strange anomalies seem to portend the character's grisly fates. And what happens is Jennings and Robert team up to uncover the truth about Damien's true lineage. And they're led on this kind of wild goose chase. They first go to the hospital, and now they're on their way to see the fire-disfigured Father Spoleto at the monastery. And during a pit stop in Italy, Jennings is reading from a scholarly work, and Robert and Jennings, they try to hash out the meaning of the poem. And Jennings ventures that, the Jews have returned to Zion and there has been a comet. There actually had been a comet that year, but it didn't receive much press coverage. And he says, as for the rise of the Roman Empire, scholars think that could well mean the formation of the common market, the Treaty of Rome. Robert understandably thinks it's a bit of a stretch. So Jennings is, of course, he's referring to the establishment of the State of Israel in 1978, and he's also referring to the 1957 treaty that led to the establishment of the European Economic Community, also known as the Common Market. And as for the eternal sea mentioned in the poem, Jennings explains that theologians have already interpreted it to mean the world of politics, the sea that constantly rages with turmoil and revolution. So the devil's child will rise from the world of politics. So needless to say, I think the turmoil, it would have required no elaboration for 1970s audiences. I think they would have been all too familiar with the fallout from Watergate and Vietnam and Arab-Israeli hostilities, and also the economically crippling oil crisis. But otherwise, as critic Duncan Lee Cooper commented in his review for Cineast, he writes that, quote, that there is no hint in the Omen of the real dangers which beset the apparently idyllic world of the Thornes and their class: wars, revolutions, economic collapse. Presumably a millionaire diplomat, a man with presidential aspirations like Robert Thorne, would be concerned with these problems. Instead, Thorne remains completely obsessed not with real dangers, but with the amorphous menace embodied in a 5-year-old child. So you can see some classic displacement scapegoating mechanisms at work here. So at this juncture, I'd like to make the important point that I think there is good reason to consider the Omen Robert's and not Damien's story. I think the character appears in about 80% of the scenes. I think Robert Thorne is the closest to being the focalizer, the main character through which the story unfolds. It begins with him in a hospital in Rome, in which he helps kind of set off a chain of events that climaxes on the altar of a church in England. And in one respect, I think that Damien, he's little more than a driver for the plot. He's kind of a MacGuffin in the Hitchcockian sense. He kind of triggers the characters to either protect him or destroy him. He has kind of very little on-screen presence, and what is said about him seems to take on more importance than what he actually says or does, which is to say that he's an absent presence in the film. If you read interviews with Gregory Peck in the 1970s, he kind of saw himself as ideally suited to the role of an American ambassador. And I think it's really fun to speculate about the extent to which Peck might have identified with the Robert Thorne character. We know that he was a loyal and liberal Democrat. He knew and admired JFK. And in 1976, he actually narrated the documentary special Years of Lightning, Days of Drums, in memory of the slain president. He was also, interestingly, on the master list of Nixon's political opponents. He spoke out against the Vietnam War, even though I think one of his sons actually served in the war. And he was also very active in his support of Democratic campaigns. David Thompson, in his biographical dictionary of film, he even goes as far as to say that the Peck persona is, quote, Kennedy-like, preferring to act in crisis and always cosmetically vindicated. What's more, Peck was a modern liberal Roman Catholic, and at one stage he actually contemplated becoming a priest, and he played one on 2 occasions. And he played one in only his second film, The Keys of the Kingdom. He played a missionary priest, scoring his first Oscar nomination. And he also essayed the real-life Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty in the made-for-TV The Scarlet and the Black, which I think was made around 1983. So I think he was quite drawn to the idea of playing priests. Now, it's all that is very well, but as I said earlier, I think that you take to the Omen what you bring to it. And I think, some might construe Peck's Thorn as more of a bedfellow of Nixon or Reagan than Carter, maybe at best a moderate Republican or a Rockefeller Republican allied with the business and political elite. So I've deliberately included 2 images of Peck here, and you can see the inset, which is from To Kill a Mockingbird, where Gregory Peck was playing like a radical liberal, the very principled lawyer Atticus Finch. In many ways, it's his signature performance. It was the performance for which he earned the Academy for Best Actor. And I think people who would have known Peck and Peck's persona might have had this portrayal on their minds when they came to see The Omen. But here you also have the older Peck here from The Omen, and it's Peck, the venerable statesman. And I think as played by the going on 60 Peck, he was an actor from the old Hollywood, seeking to reinvent himself in the changing landscape of the new Hollywood after the failure of his recent movies. Robert is not exactly a young, vibrant politician for the younger generation. Rather, he may stand for the older order, too old to have been part of the 1960s and 1970s counterculture. And this order would reassert itself in the conservative counter movements of the 1970s as galvanized by the religious and the secular right. So in retrospect, I think The Omen is a fascinating document of the period. So I think the political turmoil referred to in the film, symbolized by the eternal sea of Father Brennan's religious rhyme, to me, it's suggestive of the ongoing ideological war of conservative versus liberal progressive values in contemporary American politics. Whether the film ends with the destruction of the establishment from within or a new reshaped establishment, a new world order, if you like, depends on how we read Damien and the ending, which I want to turn to next. So, Matthew, I think at this point, I should say that there are some spoilers here. So, if your viewers want to tune out right now, I'm going to talk about the ending in detail. Okay, you've been warned. In the ending, Robert drags, the kicking and screaming Damien into the church, and he's to be slayed using a set of ancient ceremonial knives. They're referred to as the knives of Megiddo or the daggers of Megiddo in the trilogy. And as I say in my book, this final scene may be read, or it's not quite the final scene, may be read as a much darker reenactment of the binding of Isaac. And we see here Robert just about to drive the dagger into his son, and he cries out, "Help, God, help me!" And Damien is crying, "Daddy, please no, Daddy, please no," which is quite unnerving in this context, because it may very well be that Damien might be just an innocent child here. Maybe everyone around him has gone a little bit crazy. As he is about to drive in the dagger that will extinguish physical life, the police storm in, shouting, "Police, drop, or I'll fire." And then we cut to a close-up of the powder load and the bullet discharging from a policeman's handgun, which is rendered in slow motion. And then the screen fills with grainy white. But the film does not end there, not quite. In the coda, we kind of witness a military-style service. It's accompanied by a news cameraman with 2, not 3 caskets on display. The place is presumably Washington, D.C., Arlington, Virginia, or such like. It was actually shot somewhere in England. The clergyman concludes the service. 3 shots are fired as the military dirge Taps is played on the bugle. Servicemen then fold the American flag and the mourners begin to disperse. Then a trench-coated man goes over to a standing figure in an overcoat and says, "Excuse me, Mr. President, when you're ready to leave, your car is right over here." He answers, "In a moment." The First Lady and the President, they have their backs to the camera with the caskets, they're kind of visible in the center of the frame. And then the camera cranes down to reveal a third person standing in between. And it's, of course, Damien. And Damien then turns his head around. He kind of stares directly into camera and proceeds to grin. And then we have Jerry Goldsmith's all-important cue, Ava Satani, a kind of a dark parody of the Latin Mass, begins to play. This, by the way, was nominated for Best Song by the Academy for that year. This fades out to the white on black quotation. I've just incorporated the quotation here for simplicity into this slide, which reads, "Here is wisdom, let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. It's a bravura closing shot, and I think it's one of the unequivocally knowing moments of the film. I mean, The Omen really is a film that kind of takes itself extremely seriously. You know, there's not much humor in The Omen. There's not much Brechtian distance, but it seems like in this final scene that Damien has just broken the fourth wall, and he and Donna are winking at the audience. And I think one suspects that I think Donna was agreeing with his prospective critics that what we've just witnessed here is hokum. It's almost like he's pulling the rug out of the entire film. But the movie almost did not end there at all. The film was to originally end with the funeral of all three, Kathy, Robert, and Damien, with 3 caskets shown. But following feedback from Hollywood executives, Alan Ladd Jr., who was the head of production at 20th Century Fox, had Donna go back to the Shepperton backlot in the spring of 1976 and shoot a new ending where the devil child lives. So it's generally accepted that this is a last-minute revision to the film, but it's interesting that a version of this ending does appear in an add-on to Seltzer's revised screenplay dated the 26th of September 1975, while the film was undergoing principal photography. And you can actually source an earlier version of the screenplay on the web. So I've seen that there is a version of that ending. However the ending came about, it would not only leave the door open for sequels, but I think it would have very far implications for the meanings we take away from the film. When you've seen the trilogy and you've seen the other films, it's very tempting to always read forward, but I'm trying to read The Omen here more on its own terms. But if Damien had died at the hands of his adoptive father, then I would think we'd have a fairly clear-cut case of order restored, that the patriarchal establishment after this very close call survives more or less intact. In South Africa, in fact, the film ended with Robert about to stab Damien, giving this exact impression. So they left out that final bit in the film. The fact that he lives puts him on track to fulfilling the prophecy that will kind of undermine and eventually overthrow or destroy the establishment from within the corridors of power. The full military honours accorded to the funeral of the ambassador and his wife also screams government conspiracy and cover-up. So whether the ending is left or right wing and its implications, it's very hard to say. And I've included here a sample of reviews that pertain particularly to the ending and to the film's politics. Films and Filming considered Damien's infiltration into the White House a heavyweight touch, and a desperate apology for any lack of evident saintliness among the political set. Let us not be quick to blame them, for they might be possessed by Satan. Roger Ebert thought that the conclusion will leave you thinking that Nixon wasn't half bad. And very bizarrely, Ebert rated the remake more highly than the original. There was also a review for Film Illustrated. This was actually a review for The Final Conflict, which was looking back on the trilogy, observed that when the Satanic stood side by side with the US president at the conclusion of Richard Donner's first innings, audiences cried aloud, Nixon, and the film's dark pessimism seemed perfectly in key with the post-Watergate paranoia that rocked American politics. For those willing to delve a bit more deeper, The Omen carried a paranoid and pernicious right-wing agenda. In his very thoughtful exegesis for cineast, that Duncan Lee Cooper acknowledged how the ending hit home the film's real theme if we strip away the supernatural trappings of the narrative. And he wrote that the kind of power which really counts today is political. And as portrayed in The Omen, the real menace to humanity lies not in Damien's supernatural power, but in his possible future rise to high political office. In the same way, not demonic force, but state power thwarts Thorne in his attempt to save us from this menace. Thus, The Omen is an exceedingly political film, and its politics are reactionary in the extreme. Very interesting, isn't it? Especially when you compare it with Robin Wood's take on the film. The Omen, according to Robin Wood, in his initial critique, was far more revolutionary in its implications. He writes that inevitably a reading of the film tends to become a reading against it. He says that one longs to reverse all its terms. Yet the rigor with which its implications are seen through to their logical conclusion is exemplary. The systematic annihilation of all the establishment characters as the devil prepares to take over the world. The implication of reading against the grain implies that, he said, that the norms by which we have lived must be destroyed and a radically new form of organization, political, social, ideological, sexual, be constructed. The alternative is the end of the world. So this is a very, very leftist, I think very Marxist reading of the film. As he acknowledges, the contemporary American horror film has very seldom confronted the implications of this reorganization. But it's very hard to tell whether Wood's reading of the film reflects his own wish fulfillment or the filmmakers, because I think he's brought a lot to the film himself. He revisits the film in Hollywood and Vietnam, and he sounds a note of dissatisfaction when he writes that The Omen, along with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, can only envision an ideology of despair instead of offering constructive, radical alternatives. That the film for him is driven by a nihilistic wish to witness the end of the world implies a subtext about the generation of post-1960s radicals, including counterculture, not so much overthrowing, but maybe annihilating the establishment altogether. If you want to view The Omen in less nihilistic terms, I think the apocalyptic radical vision that so impressed Wood may not be so radical after all, merely the replacement of one established order with another, maybe even a new world order. And I think certainly this is what's promised in The Final Conflict. Reviving Cold War fears, The Omen invokes an alien political system founded on tyranny and repression. Only communists have been replaced by Satanists. And this, of course, plays into fears issuing from the American right. For Nicholas Schreck, in his book, The Satanic Screen, he writes that the film endorses a right-wing agenda, which is, quote, concealed Christian propaganda masquerading as a mainstream movie. He writes, it moved a central tenet of the theocratic agenda to extremist born-again Christianity into the minds of its viewers. signaling a shift in American popular consciousness toward the rise of cultural Reaganism. And throughout his not uncontroversial 2 terms as president, I think Reagan, he appropriated, I think, satanic and apocalyptic rhetoric when he framed the arms race as the battle between good and evil, and communism as a story of temptation and the fall. And Reagan, of course, notoriously referred to the former Soviet Union as the evil empire. So to try to make sense of all of this, and I have to say, I don't give you any easy answers in my devil's advocate entry, but I do believe that the film is very ideologically conflicted. I think it's positioned somewhere between radical left-wing ideas and the secular and religious right. Certainly, I think critics found the Omen subtext on the corrupt state of contemporary American politics hard to miss. Yet at the time, Richard Donner declared that there was never any intention of making a movie whose emphasis was religious or philosophical. He said that there are bound to be deeper implications for some people, but The Omen is basically a genre picture. The much too grounded Richard Donner, who sadly passed away this year, he never took the movie's premise seriously, nor for that matter did David Seltzer or Star Peck, even while he called on his actors to play it straight. And it may be that, Richard Donner was having the last laugh, for I think this is a movie that's very calculated in its effects and its scares, with an ending based on audience research and a massive pre-sale campaign that cynically tapped into pre-millennial fears. For a movie about the end times, I think it was very much a movie for the times, with a political subtext that I think helps illuminate the seeds of modern American conservatism or its ultimate destruction. And for that alone, I think the film, is a very important document of the era. Thank you.
Thank you. I like your end screen there.
Lot to unpack there.
Yeah. My notes are as scrambly as ever, so that's always a good sign. Where to begin? I'm going to begin at my last thing I wrote. Because you did bring in so many politics, I feel like the one politician missing from the entirety of the read was Eisenhower. Because Eisenhower as a Republican, but a Republican whom, if you read sort of the political platforms of his time, you would mistake for progressive today.
Right.
Just in terms of even the interstate system in the United States as a public works project. But it made me think that, a lot of these actors that are coming into horror, not just Gregory Peck, but like people like George C. Scott, whom I'll get to in a minute, a bit more, coming into horror into the 70s and 80s. It's rather interesting because they formed their careers under this Eisenhower persona of masculinity, of politics and things, and now they're moving into the genre of horror. And I'm wondering if there's a way to look at that type of masculinity as a shift, as it's presented in a movie like The Omen.
Yeah, I don't know, because in some ways it's very, very conservative on that front, isn't it? And I think I think this is what Gregory Peck imports to this particular film. But it's very, very hard to say, and I have to admit I have to take that more as a comment that I haven't actually given much consideration to that earlier era. I was more concerned with the Omen's more immediate context.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about like how the audience would have already, because we bring these things to The Omen, right? And you point out Atticus Finch, but it is interesting because you think of there's a lot of actors that make these shifts. And we were talking about Cary Grant before we went on air, right? Cary Grant is one of these actors as well. Like there's the whole shift of how an audience responds to a machismo that then in the 80s goes beyond out of proportion, because where do we hit in the 80s? We get Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? That's what masculinity becomes then. And I'm wondering how these actors as almost like dinosaurs in the 70s in the horror genre, affect that shift.
I agree. Look, I think I actually will go out on a limb. I think that this film is one of Peck's best performances, because if you looked at some of the obituaries for Peck at the time, he was kind of lauded for playing roles of masculine roles of great moral fiber. And, he very, very seldom played a bad guy in films, right? And so this is a character that I think shows real undercurrents of brooding and of uncertainty that I don't think we've seen much in the Peck persona before. And I think you can interpret that as a bit of an unraveling of his masculinity, because, I mean, in this film, of course, that, Peck doesn't save the day, does he? He doesn't save the day. And his masculinity, I think, is very much in doubt. And I know that he had a lot of trouble with the last scene because, of enacting the slaying of his own son. He had a lot of trouble with it because it conflicted with his persona, and Donner and Peck had to find ways to make the scene more palatable. And and not long before Peck's own son had actually died, had committed suicide, that the producers had actually hesitated about sending the script to him because they thought it might be a bit too close to home as well. So I think, like you said, as a dinosaur, from a different era, I think you see cracks in the Peck persona here. And I think Donner did a wonderful job of pushing that persona right to the very, very limit. And I think I would rank it highly as one of Peck's best performances, because it's very nuanced and it's very brooding, and it's very understated as well. I know in the Medved brothers book, they really take Peck's performance to task. They say that he does little more but raise his left eyebrow or something. But I totally disagree. I think that Richard Donner was keying the performances down, so it was kind of like a real understatement that actually conveyed a lot more. The only exception here is, of course, Patrick Troughton as the priest. He's just hysterical and wildly over the top, but somehow it all seems to work.
Well, I mean, even the room right where he lives is just covered in pages of the Bible and things. It's funny, your anecdote reminds me, the one about listening to the script of Peck reminds me of the anecdote about Billy Wilder. His original choice for Norma Desmond was Mary Pickford, and she was so appalled that they backed out of the house facing her, just apologizing and like genuflecting as they left. So that kind of, I don't know why that triggered that into my mind as a parallel, but it did.
I was just thinking how Charlton Heston knocked back the part too as well.
Yep.
And it's interesting what Charlton Heston would have brought to the role too. Here as an actor, I don't think really admitted any cracks to his masculinity. I think he was always portraying, the macho guy, wasn't he, in his films? But
my favorite Heston is him in the Kenneth Branagh Hamlet as the player king.
That's right. Much later.
Tremendous.
Yeah.
Also, Jack Lemmon's worst performances in that film.
I'll have to revisit it.
So you brought up like a trio here of films at the start, and I could make an obvious joke about a trio, a trilogy here, but I want to challenge that because I think it should actually be 4, and it goes off the same question about these actors from this Eisenhower era. Between, I think the film that is missing is at the end, which is a 1980 film, which is The Changeling.
Okay, a fine film.
I think that completes the sort of saga. If we think about Rosemary's Baby being the point of birth and The Changeling being the point of death of the child, because the death does not happen in the Omen as it is presented. You brought up the alternate endings and the alternate sort of like Tarantino Hitchcock off-screen supposition ending. But in Changeling, there's no mistake. The death happens at the beginning that precipitates the haunt. So that's how I'm going to pose that to you, as I think it's actually 4 films, that one starts with the birth and one concludes with the death.
Well, that's a very interesting observation. Yeah. I'll have to get back to you on that.
The reason I bring that up is because I was talking to Kendall Phillips last year. He'll be back in a couple of weeks, but he stops sort of like this golden age of horror in 1980 for whatever reasons, and that's debatable. But if I look at sort of like the craftsmanship of film and how horror is constructed in the budgets of horror, even looking at something like Halloween with a $300,000 budget versus one of these types of films that has a much bigger budget, has much more known stars. I mean, you can make arguments about Donald Pleasance again. But I mean, Donald Pleasance is not Gregory Peck. And so I that's another reason I sort of like think about this film in relationship to this as a tetralogy instead of a trio, to borrow a different biblical term.
It's interesting that like that horror films, I mean, particularly Hollywood horror of the 1970s, it has a certain temperament though, isn't it? And I find it takes itself extremely seriously, and by the time we're getting to the 80s, I mean, we're going into parody here, aren't we, and self-parody, but I think there's a conviction to 1970s horror films that is lacking today. I mean, The Exorcist and The Omen, they have a hell of a lot of conviction, don't they? I mean, even though I always, as I was saying earlier, I sense Donner behind the scenes with his tongue in his cheek. And I think, it's a testament to the professionalism of all the actors that they can play it so straight, but there's just so much conviction there. And I haven't, I think the remake of The Omen is a pretty lamentable job. I think we would agree, but it made a lot of money. It made a lot of money.
I went to see it the first day. I saw it June 6, 2006. I went and saw it.
Saw it, so did I think. But I think the conviction just wasn't there anymore. It wasn't there. And I think if you look at those films, like even adding The Changeling here, I mean, all the films have an incredible amount of conviction and an internal reality that you can utterly and totally believe in. I miss those films.
No, definitely.
Yeah.
And I was trying to come up with my own sort of read in relationship to religiosity, because I was thinking Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist are both under Nixon. I mean, technically 68. I think, you've had the specter of Nixon throughout the 60s anyway, because he was vice president in the 50s. And it's interesting because he's Quaker, of course. And then you've got Carter and Reagan. I'm not sure. I think Reagan identified as Southern Baptist. I know Carter did. Obviously, Reagan is more, we think of as this evangelical version of Southern Baptist, but I mean, his allies are people who identify as such, Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell. So I'm going to lump him there. So it is interesting to me because it is, with Carter and Reagan at least, it is a certain type of devilry, right? I honestly will admit, I'm not familiar sort of like with the teachings of the Quaker religion and Satan. But I am quite familiar from my own youth with the Southern Baptist versions of the devil and the whole hellfire and brimstone. And so it is interesting to me that you do see a shift into something that is more explicitly that the devil is actively coming for everyone, right? Particularly in the Omen, in a global way.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, Rosemary's Baby, it's not really clear, he's born, right? But it's not, there's no plan beyond him being born and like drinking milk that has tannis root in it.
Well, I always think The Omen could have been the unofficial sequel to Rosemary's Baby, couldn't it? If Rosemary had given up her baby for adoption and it could have been fostered out, it could have been the true sequel to Rosemary's Baby.
No, definitely. I mean, because you think how old is Damien in the Omen? Is he 51 today, or how old is he today?
Yeah. Well, the third film, I mean, there's that
Oh,
terrible retconning that goes on, and they almost have to rewrite the timelines of the last two films, and it's terrible, you know.
well, the ending
Almost
is
have to-
also just abysmal. I mean, Sam Neill does the best he can, but
Well, he's not a bad actor, though, right? He's not a bad
no,
actor.
Sam Neill's a great actor, but like
Yeah,
when you actually, it's Jesus who comes and defeats him at the end, right?
that's right. And I think it has some good ideas, though. I think he's trying to recast Damien as kind of like a Miltonic, Blakean, sympathetic devil figure, but of course it doesn't ever really quite come off, does it?
No.
No.
Well, there's no
I've watched it a
discourse. I
few
mean, that's
times.
the problem with Milton, right? You need the discourse
Yeah,
with God. You need, like,
yeah,
in Milton, Lucifer can just pick up his phone and call God at any time, and they debate each
yeah,
other. That does not occur, and it would
yeah.
be comical, I think, if we actually saw it. I've realized that a lot this year. That a lot of the representation of villainy turns comic very easily,
Yes, I agree. Yeah,
um, which is interesting too, because you talked about the film being more about Robert Peck's character than being about Damien,
yeah,
um,
yeah.
and I think it's the same reason.
Mm.
Um, did you watch Good Omens, by the way?
No, no.
Okay, that's almost like a rehash of it, the Neil Gaiman piece that was on Amazon with David Tennant as the demon.
Okay, I like David.
Yeah,
Fine
yeah.
actor.
I mean, it's an interesting idea in there, but it is very much a similar telling. I mean, even down to like the dog appearing on his birthday and things. It's very much a retelling of the Omen in that way,
Yeah,
but with a
yeah,
happy, feel good ending.
yeah, yeah. The Devil Dog. Yeah,
Yeah,
history
I
there.
never got the maid in that. Her name escapes me, but oh man.
Yeah. Oh, Mrs. Baylock. Do you remember?
Yeah, she is like the oldest like Hollywood trope, right? Like she
That's
walked
right.
right out of Rebecca and got this job.
Yeah. Well, I have seen comparisons, and it's interesting the way the Lee Remick character Kathy, well, she gets pushed out of the window, right, at the hospital building. Never mind. I mean, I was always wondering how she just made it through that glass. It wouldn't have been high grade glass or something, but these are things that we don't think about. But there's a similar scene in Rebecca, where Mrs. Danvers is hovering over the second Mr. Winter and is goading her to throw herself out the window as well. But I think there are there are parallels between these characters, and as you said, I think there's a long history here of unstable governesses, isn't it? And nanny, yeah,
Well, that's such a
yeah,
gothic thing, right? That's right out Jane Eyre. That's I'm always cautious about using the word gothic, and I've talked about that quite a bit actually this year. But that is a gothic trope, the unstable governess or the
yeah.
polluting governess from the 19th century.
And let's not forget the first governess, Holly, who hangs
Oh yeah,
herself at the children's party. So
yeah,
yeah,
it's all for you.
yeah,
I
yeah.
also realized, going back to Rosemary's Baby for a second, I realized I'm talking to an Adrian about all of this.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, irony there. Adrian, or was it Andrew? We don't really quite know, do we? Yeah,
He says Adrian,
yeah, it is
the
Adrian.
old guy at the end when
Yeah,
he's
it is
when
Adrian.
she,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think there was some uncertainty, or I'm not sure if this was in R11's book whether it would be Adrian or Andrew, wasn't it? Yeah,
Okay.
it is eventually Adrian. Yeah,
Um, but yeah,
mm,
so
yeah,
maybe it's you. How old are you again?
could be.
um, have you seen the film Secret Honor by Robert Altman?
No, I haven't, and I like Altman. Yeah, why?
I'm going to recommend that one to you. It's from 1984.
Yeah.
It's actually a really cool story behind that film. He shot it with a group of college students. It's essentially a monologue, but it's Richard Nixon, and
Okay. Yep.
it's Nixon back in San Clemente, right, after he's left the White House, and it's him one evening sort of like losing his mind and doing this monologue, like, and screaming at a portrait of Henry Kissinger and things.
Oh,
But
gee,
at
that's
one
personal.
point, he talks about this almost like Illuminati-esque conspiracy ritual that he took part in, that made him president. Like they're at like this campsite and there's fires and everything. So I want to highly recommend that to you if
Okay.
you're familiar.
What's that called again?
Secret Honor.
Secret Honor. Okay.
It's also just a tremendous acting performance, and it's Robert Altman, so it's always worth a watch. But not a horror film, but I think it goes in line with some of the personifications you were talking about. And it is interesting to see that extend into 84 under Reaganism as sort of, because obviously it's Nixon you have to thank for Reagan's political strategy, if nothing else, right? Nixon is the one who goes to the American South and flips it red from blue. And then Reagan follows the same suit, and every other Republican has basically done the same thing ever since.
Yes. I mean, I drew heavily on Kevin M. Cruise's and Julian E. Zellers's book, Fault Lines. I don't know if you're familiar with that book, but it looks at American history since 1974. And they see the 70s as this pivotal decade for this, rupture that we see today, between, I mean, it was always there, right? But it became particularly pronounced in the 1970s that historians like to forget this era, think of it as a little bit misspent, but it's actually the era that it reads like a history of the present now. I mean, and I think the Omen, that's why I really firmly believe that the Omen is quite an important document of the era. I think you can see these tensions and these ruptures at work in the film.
I think partially too, because 68 is both in terms, I mean, I think about Europe and the United States having these ruptures in 1968. And I think people just get hung up there. Because as you say, I mean, they're sort of, there's a lot more to draw. I mean, there's so many political assassinations in the United States in 1968, right? And you have also like the major musical shifts with like the Monterey Festival and things that happen in 68.
Yes.
And so I think that's where some of the pop cultural shift happens. And of course, Rosemary's Baby, as you say.
Yeah. I mean, let's not forget the whole subplot with Jennings and his photographs there. I mean, that is the legacy, isn't it, of the Zapruder film and uncovering strange anomalies. This is where it all became this big thing. And when you pair those two actors together, Peck and David Warner, I mean, the conspiracy just gets a whole lot bigger, doesn't it? And it starts kind of spiraling out of control. But to me, it doesn't. Now it's reading like I don't know. It's reading more like fact now. I mean, we do have people now. It doesn't seem so far-fetched. We don't have to endorse or believe in these prophecies, but we know there are a lot of people out there who do believe in this sort of stuff.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it is interesting to see those scenes when he's developing the film and such.
Yeah, scary scenes.
But they're so subtle. If it was today, you'd have red thread going everywhere and things, right? I think there is a film actually called The Conspiracy, which is about a global elite group that hunt people like Most Dangerous Game style and things.
Yeah, well, it's actually like the Omen is not it's not that overt in its use of effects. And I know that the early iterations of the screenplay, Donner had Seltzer he had him take out all the references to devil hoofed figures and demons and that sort of thing. So you actually don't see any of that sort of stuff in the movie. And it was a film that was conceived on two different levels, that a lot of the supernatural happenings might actually have an explanation after all, that nothing that you really witness in the film is impossible. It could actually happen. I think this is something that has been forgotten in the wake of the sequels, because we do take it as a given that Damien is the spawn of the devil, but that's not the way the film was conceived. There's actually, as I discuss at length in my my monograph on the Omen, that it's a film where ambiguity is built right into the narrative, that there's always two levels of interpretations, that Damien might actually be an innocent child after all. And I think that's because, as you said, I think in the 2006 remake, it's much more overt, isn't it, in the use of effects and imagery. So it leaves no doubt in our mind that Satan is at work here. There's a possible interpretation that there is a satanic cult, and that the people around Damien believe in this sort of stuff but whether this has any a correspondence or to reality as we know it is a completely different question. So I think it's worth, if you haven't seen The Omen recently, watch it again. But there's really nothing in the movie that strikes us as impossible necessarily.
I'm going to take one exception to that, and that's the cemetery scene.
With the dogs, yeah? What
Yeah.
so? Well, you know, I don't deny that there may be a satanic conspiracy at work. But
I mean, he's buried with a jackal. The
Yeah,
baby
but
who
that-
was murdered was buried with a jackal with his head bashed in.
Yeah, but we could ascribe this to some nutters, right? Some extremely unhinged people.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I think you're getting very conspiratorial at that point. If
Yeah.
that would be my one exception, because I mean, there is a supernatural quality to the dogs arriving and things.
A supernatural quality, I think that's a good way of describing it, but not necessarily supernatural. Look, even Donna has said that, you know, maybe you know, that Lee Remick's character just panics, and you know that she throws herself out the window, for example. It could be a case of death by misadventure, for example.
I mean, the deaths are particularly gruesome.
Yes.
I mean, we're actually fortunate that it is a 70s movie just because of the nonsensical way that they would be portrayed today. Like if you go see Halloween Kills right now, right? The level of over-the-top violence and the lingering on like blood and gore would be there, like with the decapitation with the plate of glass and things. We would linger on that for so much longer in an unnecessary way.
Yeah. I mean, there are some very elaborate set pieces, but I'm sort of going against the grain with what you just said, that I think a lot of the horror is psychological rather than graphic, but people tend to remember those set pieces though, isn't it? Those very brilliant set pieces. When I was revisiting the Final Destination films, it struck me how some of those deaths had seemed to be kind of modeled on the sort of things that we see in The Omen, you know.
Like with the log coming through the windshield. That's
right. You know, like a worker who doesn't, who lets loose the handbrake and the car rolls and the pane of glass. You know, just, you know, a sequence of events that sounds improbable or unlikely, but maybe could happen. Maybe could.
It's true. It is interesting in terms of like the maybe could, because that is a big aspect of Rosemary's Baby, right? Like she might just be nuts for the majority of the film.
Yeah, I think Donna must have taken some inspiration from that film. I think the whole approach to that film. I think.
Which, I mean, you get the inverse in The Exorcist, right? Like the doctors are so thoroughly incompetent, right? Medical science just endlessly like profanes itself in that film, which is it's almost hilarious. Like at the point where she's like going up and down, like we think it's Tourette's. You know, her stuff is flying around the room.
Yeah, I mean, look, the book is a little bit more of an ambiguous affair, isn't it? But you can get away with that, isn't it, with prose? But when we see this stuff happening, we kind of wonder why Chris McNeil didn't go and seek out a priest a little bit earlier, especially in the director's cut where we have the inclusion of that scene, you know, where Reagan's coming down the stairs.
The spider walk.
Yeah, because it seems to dissent the narrative a little bit, and the motivation somewhat by including that scene. You just kind of wonder why Chris didn't seek.
Well, because she's an atheist, isn't it?
She is, but I thought that would be enough. If I had seen that happening, I would have gone in there a little bit earlier and thought outside the box.
See, but I mean, I don't know. That's like a teleological view, I feel like.
Fair enough.
You're like, yes, she must be possessed. I study these things.
Yeah,
well, she's also an absent mother, right? She's a very clear archetype of a modern woman, absent mother.
Yeah.
And she's divorced, so you have the missing patriarch, and then so of course the patriarch comes back in literalism of two fathers returning to remove the demon.
Absolutely, yeah.
Not to get overly Freudian here.
No, but I mean that's how the film has been read, hasn't it? I mean, they often single out like E.T. as being a main, you know, it's one of the first films to have a mainstream kind of dysfunctional family with the absent father. But of course, The Exorcist was there a lot earlier, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the father's also just like clearly like a sinner, like is actually the impetus for the possibility of the demon in a lot of ways, because he's clearly living in sin, right? He's living with this woman he's not married to, who's, I don't know, they're in a hotel or something on her birthday.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, look, I'm picking up your point earlier, like you were saying about in The Exorcist. I mean, look, it does take a long time to exhaust all the alternative explanations before we arrive at the conclusion that Reagan is possessed. But something similar is going on in The Omen, because even with all these horrific deaths, that Thorne is right to the end, doubting himself. Even when he receives the knives, I mean, he still says, I need proof. I need proof. And that's the point where, Jennings snatches the knives away from him. Do you remember? And he gets decapitated. Mm-hmm. And then Thorne has to retrieve the knives. But still, that's not enough. He's got to go home and he's got to get out the cutting shears and look for the telltale mark on his head.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that in some ways the film doesn't commit itself to the supernatural explanation, not really right till the very end, where it seems pretty unequivocal with the 3 sixes. But look, I could even argue that, because we see that same telltale mark on Father Brennan's body, that it could be some sort of branding as well, couldn't it? Like
all these people like fail in relationship to doubt itself, right? In each of these movies, right?
Yeah.
Father Karras fails because of Father Marin's doubt. Or sorry, Maris fails. Yeah, I said it right the first time.
Yeah.
Right. It's his ultimate struggles with his own faith that leads to Karras dying, and then himself dying by flinging himself out of a window again.
Yes.
Same in Rosemary's Baby. She seeks out different expert advices, and it collapses and fails. Same in The Omen. He fails because he hesitates.
Yeah, I mean, do you think the Rosemary's Baby confirms its supernatural reality at the end? I mean, even with the eyes superimposed on the screen.
I don't know if it confirms it, but she gives herself over to it, I believe.
Yeah,
she joins the cult, if nothing else.
Yeah, for sure. But I think there's still ambiguity in Rosemary's Baby right to the end as well. I've heard Polanski say that that the eyes could be, some sort of projection, some sort of a delusion, an aspect of her delusion, but we
like
never
postpartum depression kind of thing.
Yeah, we never see the devil child.
No,
maybe Polanski knew that it would just be a letdown.
Well, also something's wrong with its feet too, right? Like it does have like cloven feet or something. Because like that one lady's like, and his feet.
Yeah, maybe forgot about that.
But that whole experience could be a delusion.
Yeah.
I mean, Rosemary gets very drawn up in her state, right? But not that her husband has helped any.
Well, it's interesting with the two husbands and the motivations of the husbands, isn't it? That the husband making a kind of Faustian pact and allowing his wife to, be subjected to ritual abuse and bear, the son of Satan. But you can contrast that with the motivations of the Robert Thorne character. I mean, he's supposedly acting out of love, right?
Sure. I mean, the weird thing about the Rosemary's Baby too is that like he's okay with basically raping his wife, or her believing that he raped her.
Yeah.
Right. Because he says you passed out, but you were ovulating, so I had sex with your body while you were asleep.
That's right.
And I mean, she has a problem with it, right? She really didn't appreciate it, but like that's it. It's moved beyond. It doesn't ever get a point of readdress.
Yeah. So I think. Yeah, absolutely.
We went down our own conspiratorial rabbit hole here, I believe. I want to talk a little bit about Father Spoleto, because this also took me down a different reading with him. I started to think of Dante and the Inferno in relationship to Spoleto, and then the different scenarios, because that hospital, of course, burns down. The fire starts in the maternity ward. I think it's the next day after they leave. And the goal of the fire, right, is to destroy the Hall of Records.
Very conveniently.
But you do get a lot of aspects, I think, lifted from the Inferno in relationship to the Omen as well. And I was wondering if you'd ever come across any reading that had a parallel to
I haven't, and look, it hasn't occurred to me. I mean, look, I can still make some additions to the manuscript. So I'm going to take some notice here, you know.
Because it's so weird because he deteriorates, right? We find him in a monastery, supposedly, I guess, being very medieval and having everybody pray for his mortal soul. He's mute at this point, but his face, as you showed in the picture, like the Phantom of the Opera all of a sudden too.
That's right. And somehow blind, half blind, but the seer who can actually understand more than the rest of the characters. And what does he do with his one good arm? He's inscribing with charcoal, on the stone floor about the location of the cemetery. I mean, Seltzer's book gives a little bit more background on this point, that it is a worldwide satanic conspiracy, but the characters are imagined a little bit differently in the book as well, and there are some really important divergences between the film and the book. But I mean, it's actually something really, really worth exploring. How do you see it being played out, the Dante connections with that character?
Well, he clearly is deteriorating physically in relationship to his repentance against Satan, right? And so that's causing his punishment physically to happen, right? It's not happening because of a relationship to God. And that's a pretty common medieval Renaissance relationship to the devil. Once you forsake the devil, you get punished in a visceral fashion. So he's becoming sort of grotesque in that relationship. I see some of the set pieces become relational to the different circles, I guess, in Dante. Because the other film, I guess, that's missing for me in all of this is not an American film. It would be Sallow.
Yes.
In terms of just like the degrees of frenzy and government conspiracy and things. Also, I want to say 76 as well, maybe 77. And so I see that in sort of like in tandem to these ideas of sort of like hell on earth and how it's being explored.
All right, I'll take that on advisement. I can make some last minute additions here.
No worries. That's the extent of my notes that I took during your talk. But I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm always happy to hear somebody talk about the Omen.
Well, not much has been written on it, surprisingly, apart from those initial reviews. And as I said, I think at the outset, I think it's amazing how the film has actually experienced a bit of a decline in its reputation, and I think it's maybe it's not up there with The Exorcist or Rosemary's Baby, but I think it's still there. It's regularly included on lists by experts and critics.
Well, I think too the other thing, going back to The Changeling just for a second on that, is that Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist sync up with the shift into the 70s of the feminist movement and that aesthetic, particularly in America. But what's interesting, if you do take on my tetralogy here, is that you get the reestablishment of the patriarchy in the Omen and the Changeling, moving toward Reaganism.
Yes, you do. Unless you're Robin Wood, where you might read against the grain,
Sure.
You might think because Robin Wood's interesting. He says that when you watch The Omen, you want to reverse all the terms, and it's a movie that kind of revels in binary oppositions, right? Like delusion and reality and sanity.
It ends in the Oedipus complex. It ends with the failure of the father to penetrate the son with a phallus. So it ends in the most like in complete reaction to sort of like masculinity and its rejection.
Yeah. I would endorse that reading. I mean, others have read it somewhat differently, but I think I would go with that reading.
Well, particularly being Catholic, right? It's
Yeah.
it's the super masculine structure deteriorates due to this man's impotence, and then the boy lives, and they get picked up by another masculine, powerful figure in the form of the president of the United States. And it doesn't matter what political party you put him in; it's still a guy with power.
Yeah. So you're thinking, is it conservative?
I don't think it matters. It's that it predicts, if anything, the masculinity you see inherent in the 1980s that poses so many issues in horror. Which is fascinating to me because it does it in a much better way, I feel like, than a slasher movie.
Yeah.
Where it's just super obvious, phallus, stab woman, right? It does it in a much more nuanced way that actually predicts the politics and the personification. If you think moving completely forward to 2000, it predicts something like Patrick Bateman.
Yeah. There is a line of continuity there. Yeah. What to wrestle with, isn't there?
Wrestle with the demons, as it were. So I want to thank you for being on tonight. I really enjoyed it. I want to invite everybody who's watching to take the survey that Juan is about to drop into the various chats. Invite you to tune in tomorrow night for Leslie Klinger's talk on horror, and also talking about his various annotations. And as always, stay spooky.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, yeah. No, it's really cool. I'm looking forward to reading the full manuscript so I have a better idea.
I told you I'd have a bit of trouble with the Q&A time, but I don't know.
Why?
I always think I'll get perfect responses later, afterwards.
I mean, are there perfect responses? I mean, we're just having a discourse about intellectual ideas. So.
Yeah, no, but I like your Dantean reading. I'm going to see if I can revisit my manuscript and
just as long as you special thanks me.
Yeah, I'll dedicate it to you. How would you like that?
Even better. Dedicated to the guy who completely made me rethink what I wanted to say. No, it's because I rewatched The Omen about 2 weeks ago, I guess. Sometimes I like to watch an oldie but a goodie, and the Omen is definitely one I go back to quite frequently. And actually, The Changeling, because I love George C. Scott in horror.
Yeah. I mean, look, I haven't seen that film for a while, which I wasn't able to comment on it at length, but I remember it as being a very, very fine film, though, and quite a scary film. But as you said, now I'm just trying to recall details from it, because there's a political plot there. A child has been substituted as well, isn't it? That's where it comes from. Was it Melvin Douglas? The Melvin Douglas character, isn't he? He's actually the Changeling, isn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah.